This week on Life and Faith.
I'm not looking at Gareth and deliberately trying to create, certainly in the first 5 drafts, not trying to create a complex character with nuance and lots of moving parts to him. I'm writing what I see around me in people.
If something happens at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, you're at work.
She had saved my life, and I felt as if she was around me that I was going to live.
You can't just condemn everything that doesn't play by your rules.
None of those who were present raised their hand.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
I'm Max Jagannathan.
Now, Max, it's no surprise to lovers of literary fiction like me that stories have the power to do much more than just entertain. And today's guest has demonstrated this in a way that has taken Australia's literary community by storm, it's fair to say. Shankari Chandran is a Sri Lankan Tamil Australian who was once told that her writing wasn't Australian enough. And she's now published 5 novels, one of which, Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, won the prestigious Miles Franklin Literary Prize last year. Now, Shankari's writing explores a number of themes that have resonated with lots of us and certainly with you, Max, and you were keen to explore this.
That's right, Simon. It was a real pleasure to interview Shankari. I've always loved her writing, and there are plenty of parallels, coincidentally, in our stories too.
There really are. It's great.
There are, yeah. So we're both Sri Lankan Tamils. We both left Sri Lanka with our families because of the Civil War. We've both worked as lawyers. We've spent time in the UK. And perhaps most prominently, we've grappled with the challenges and opportunities that come with cross-cultural identities.
Yeah, it sets us up for a great conversation, Max. Now, Shankari's breakout bestseller, Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, is set in a small nursing home in Sydney. But it covers themes from race relations in Australia to Sri Lanka's civil war to the intricacies of human relationships, marriage struggles, and the complexity of identity. It's all in there. Now, this was a coup to get Shankari on the show, Max.
It certainly was, Simon. I was really thrilled for the opportunity to speak with her and just excited to have her as a guest on Life and Faith. So I began by asking Shankari about how she went about bringing together such a breadth of themes and issues in just one story.
I knew that I wanted to set a story in a nursing home, which was where my grandmother had spent the last years of her life. I knew that it was a great location to talk about community and to talk about the way in which storytelling can be used to share memories and history and religion and spirituality and politics and recipes through generations, across generations, and that storytelling could be used to create community wherever you were. I also knew that I wanted to talk about race, racism, and identity.
Right.
And so that was really the focal point, the sort of almost parameters of the novel were that when I started. And yet as time, as the writing progressed, as is often the way, one story leads to another, leads to another, leads to stories within stories.
Yes.
And it's impossible in some ways when exploring some of those big themes to not also inevitably explore the beautiful detail of the micro themes, because you're talking about real people and their real lives. And that's will inevitably include and involve family, marriage, relationship strain,
right,
and so on. And so you get into the detail of it and the guts of it pretty quickly.
That's just a fascinating insight, I think, for a lot of our listeners for what writing fiction and literature is. You create these characters and then they almost literally come to life on the page, right? And they develop their own stories and personalities, and then there are just ways that they just flow, of course, when writing's going well. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I think at a certain point they cease to be characters and they cease to be something that I'm constructing. They are people in their own right. They're people in my mind. And they are telling the story that wants to be told. And I'm just there to serve the story. I'm just there to write it down. I'm no longer making it up. I'm just writing it down.
Now, you're a Sri Lankan Thamil Australian. I'm a Sri Lankan Thamil Australian as well. And certainly for me and many diasporic Tamils, and I'm sure, from many folks from other countries too, from various immigrant and refugee communities, a big challenge for us is balancing that tension between our Australian identity and that sense of loss, disconnection, obligation to our mother country as well. How's that journey been for you and how's that influenced your writing?
So you've used an interesting word there, Max, balancing.
Hmm.
And I think when I was younger, I struggled to navigate what seemed to be two separate worlds, the white Australia of my youth and my schooling, and then this life at home where my family was very committed to maintaining culture, connection to community. And that seemed to also involve, to some degree, sequestering us from wider Australia. And so we were code switching and culture switching when we left the house and then returned to the house. And I know that I struggled with that and was always feeling as though I was lost between two places. And as I've grown older and perhaps more comfortable in my skin, perhaps more aware of who I am, I've become much better able to recognize and celebrate the multiplicity of identities that I carry within me and the different ways that they enrich my life and the different ways that I can harness them to enrich community life around me, being both my ancestral community and the wider Australian community. So there's a real acceptance and harnessing of that and using of it almost as part of life, which has been a beautiful part of growing older. And I think also that writing has really helped me with that, because I'm writing everything I'm thinking, everything I'm feeling, everything I'm navigating, I'm putting down on paper, and it's helping me understand it.
Right. And I think that's obviously at least one of the reasons why, your writing has such resonance, obviously with wider Anglo-Australia, but especially with kind of expatriate immigrant communities in Australia. Certainly with me, what you just commented on resonates entirely, very powerfully, the code switching, the kind of back and forth, the arm wrestle, if you like. And then as you get older, finding that it can actually be a platform. This kind of mixed identity is actually a beautiful, separately, newly created thing that you can use. How much of your personal journey then is baked into some of your protagonist characters? I think, the characters like Ellie in Unfinished Business, Maya and Anjali in Chai Time, Lucky in Safe Haven. There seems to be a lot of that dynamic.
Strong and confused women?
Exactly.
Is that what you're trying to say,
Strong,
Max?
confused, capable, high-functioning, but wrestling with those dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been 5 novels now, and it's probably just 5 novels of therapy, really. There's a lot of me baked into it. I think Maya is who I want to be when I grow up.
Right.
Because Maya, out of all of my characters, I think she is the most comfortable with who she is, and not just as a function of getting to the age of 80 plus, but because she has been challenged by life and she has survived it, and she has accepted her strengths and understood her weaknesses, and she's constantly building community that she draws on to empower her, but she also empowers and uplifts. I love Maya's, both her literary leaning and her commitment to service. And I think both of those things give Maya real strength. So Maya is certainly who I want to be when I grow up.
Yes.
And Ellie is probably my alter ego, except that I'm less violent, obviously, because Ellie is a CIA agent who goes into...
So for our listeners that haven't read Unfinished Business, Ellie's this kind of expat Australian-American Thamil CIA agent that goes back to Sri Lanka, and she's, once again, embodies a lot of this kind of strength and get up and go and confidence and security in her identity, but still grappling with the dual identities, right?
And that dual identity for work purposes enables her to navigate different worlds. And that's part of my own life. The fact that I am a small brown woman with many children means that I can navigate certain spaces with incredible ease. People feel safe around me because of a certain way that I present. And I am learning to lean into that, and I'm learning to utilize that in both my social justice work, my storytelling work, and just generally ways of being. So instead of that aspect of my life making me feel vulnerable or in some way stifled, I see that as a strength and something that gives me power. And Ellie has that same sort of, yes, it's hard to navigate two worlds. I've done terrible things in my home country or my ancestral country. And I, as a CIA agent, seem to be doing terrible things around the world. So I'm grappling with redemption. But at the same time, there's strength that I'm drawing on from that ancestry and from that capability.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that multiple dimensionality of human identity, I think, comes through really powerfully as all of that plays out. More specifically to you, I guess, I mean, you recognise in characters like Ellie and various others that human identity is multifaceted. There's always multiple dimensions at play: race, ethnicity, religion, culture. We've talked a bit about culture. How does your faith background kind of play into your writing and your influence as a writer?
So it's hugely present in my writing. When I think about, or if you were to look at every novel that I've written, including even Unfinished Business, which is more of a pure political thriller in the tradition of, John le Carré, even that novel, Ellie draws on culture, or the characters around Ellie are immersed in culture, their own religion, and it guides their moral framework.
Right.
And Ellie is informed by their moral framework that they have extracted, or that has been influenced and informed by their culture and religion. And so for me, religion and my faith as a Hindu is a very important part of my life. And the religion, the spirituality, the cultural practices and rituals around it, in particular the rituals of life and death and the transitions between childhood to adulthood or girlhood to womanhood, and the concept of dharma, righteousness,
right,
and the morality that my characters that form their sort of bedrock is all drawn from Hinduism. So it's endemic to my life, and organically so, and therefore it is, all of my writing is infused with it.
Yeah, which I think is fascinating and really important, that at a first principle level, you can hear a lot these days, particularly in the mainstream cultural conversation and in the public square, that religion should be reduced to just this tiny little fringe thing that's like an accessory you have in your back pocket. But your answer and your characters and your own journey shows that that's really not possible. It is, in your own words, kind of endemic and organic. It's a pretty big part of who we are for people of faith.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I must say that I don't, when I do get asked in certain forums about religion, spirituality, faith, it's not that I dismiss the question, because it's a really important question and I love to engage with that with you. It is also, though, that it's such a natural part of my life, right? That of course it's going to appear in my literature. Like, why is anyone surprised? Because it's my normal.
Yes,
right.
Correct.
I'm left-handed. I'm brown. I eat Sri Lankan chicken curry more often than I'm likely to have lamb chops. And I have a faith that is thousands of years old and has certain tenets of belief that I adhere to.
And so any suggestion that people of faith just kind of check their faith at the door before they walk into a room is similar to asking us to check our left hand at the door, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Or even worse, our chicken curry at the door.
100%, Max. Now you're speaking my language.
I was reading about crime fiction author Donna Leon, who gave an interview to the Financial Times recently. She said something really interesting that made me think of you and some of your work. She said, discussing fiction is just as important as reading it. Could you just talk a little, Shankari, about the importance of storytelling in modern society? I know that's a big open-ended question, but...
That is a big open-ended question,
yeah.
Max. I think for writers, writing is much more important than the talking about the writing, because that's what we love to do. At the same time, I think that the talking about the writing and the books and the storytelling is very important, particularly in this time where it is very difficult to know what the truth is, and it is difficult to trust those previously trusted sources of information. And where conversation, particularly public conversation, can deteriorate very quickly into vitriol and into divisive, fear-driven conversations. I mean, at that point, they're not even conversations. And so we're losing the art of how to, and not even the art, we're losing the values that sit behind respectful conversation where both sides are trying to understand each other and come to the truth.
Yes.
We're no longer explorers together. We are adversaries. And I don't believe that we've always been like that. I think we are innately explorers and collaborators and friends than we are combatants and adversaries. And so storytelling creates a very, very safe environment in which to explore the truth.
Yes.
And in which to debate, to the extent that a debate of the truth is possible, because then we obviously go into a sort of more fundamental discussion around what is the truth. But we don't have time for that in this podcast.
Right.
So storytelling creates a space in which the reader is invited in and chooses to be there. And hopefully, if the writer, I think, has done what I would consider to be a good job, the reader feels safe to have their worldview, to have their values, to have what they thought they knew challenged.
Right.
And expanded for new experiences and dimensions to be brought into that reader's mind and heart.
Yes. So it's almost like a gymnasium for empathy.
That's a nice way. Your words, not mine. That's excellent.
It sounds a bit sterile, but that's what the studies show, right? That both writers and readers of fiction have a greater natural capacity for empathy. And that's what we're lacking more and more out there, in the public square, and we're needing more and more of.
Yes. Yeah, I like that a lot. I like to make my reader feel very, very uncomfortable.
Yes.
And challenged and self-reflective. But in order to do that, I need to access their curiosity and make them feel safe so they are willing to step into that space and be curious.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're hearing Max speak to fellow Sri Lankan Tamil Australian and author Shankari Chandran about her writing, her influences, and how she uses storytelling to build empathy and tackle injustice, break down barriers. Max goes on here to ask Shankari about how her writing, though fictional, intentionally picks up on real historical and political events and injustices.
Literature has an extraordinary opportunity, and writers, to some degree, particularly writers like myself, I think we have a responsibility to use literature to explore injustice. And I say some writers because I don't, if anything, perhaps I should just speak for myself, that I, from my position of power and privilege, and as someone that has left before a civil war even started, and has therefore received the enormous benefits of a life outside of that horror, that I believe I have a responsibility, or to frame it in religious terms, my dharma, to write stories that explore those injustices and tell the untold stories, to create a place for memories to be recorded for culture, history, and injustices, but also the joys and the strengths and the greatness of our community to be remembered and celebrated. Yes. And that's what I think literature can do, particularly because there is so much information out there in the world, Max. And when I was writing Safe Haven, this really was brought home to me very starkly that there is so much information, for example, about the suffering of asylum seekers who are indefinitely detained onshore and offshore. But we struggle to access that information, even though a simple Google search would provide it.
Right.
We struggle to read it, to read to the end of the report, to read past the front page or the executive summary. And then we struggle to remember it because we're human. We're only human, and we are inundated with information. And it's much easier to watch Netflix than it is to read a report from the Australian Human Rights Commission. I understand that.
Right.
Literature and fiction draws you in.
Yes.
And if the writer has done their job properly, it keeps you there. So you'll read from the first page to the last page, and you'll go on that journey with those protagonists, and you will feel what they feel, and you will feel for them. And if it's written really well, you will remember.
Yeah, which is just enormously powerful and really does recognise and work responsively within the cultural currents. If entertainment is the currency of the day, then truth doesn't have to suffer as a result, right?
Exactly. I like a truthful tale told entertainingly as much as the next person.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, you mentioned Sri Lanka's civil war. It's the exact same civil war that my family was caught up in, and is the reason that that we made it to Australia too. I just wanted to pick you up on, something that you said early in that answer, which is both refreshing and I think confronting for a lot of people, is that you wanted to use your gifts and your resources and your level of privilege and the opportunities you've had that many haven't. A lot of people may look at people like us, refugees, expats, diasporic Tamils and others from other parts of the world, and think that privilege is not something that applies to us. But clearly the reality is much more nuanced, that we all have cards that we're dealt. We all have both blessings and opportunities and capacities, and that's interesting. You want to talk a little bit more about that, this idea of privilege, that it's not all black and white?
Yeah, I think perhaps been so aware of my privilege for so long, and I don't mean that self-righteously or in a virtue signaling sort of way. I just mean that my parents have raised us to be aware of it, not in a a sort of burdensome, guilt-ridden manner, but in a sense of, this is the life we've worked hard for to give you. And many people work hard and because of the circumstances of their life are simply not able to do that. They work just as hard as us, but are not able to, for whatever reason, give their children what we've given you.
Yes.
And in many cases, it's because they simply were not able to leave.
Hmm.
And my parents were from an educated middle class and utilized their education to leave.
Yes.
And to leave before the war started. And then we watched them watch the war. We didn't just watch the war, we watched them watch the war. And we watched them be grief-stricken and feel guilty and feel enraged and powerless and back to grief.
Yes.
Because of what was happening in their home. We were forging our own home in Australia, but this was very much their home.
Yeah.
And it was being destroyed. And people that they knew were dying. And that gave them a very strong sense of responsibility to do something, whatever they could, from the diaspora. And we were raised watching that and feeling that, not, again, as I said, not as a burden, but as a responsibility and the privilege of privilege, right?
Yes.
It's my privilege to serve because I've been given these privileges.
Right.
And we were taught this particular sort of saying, which probably sounds better in Sanskrit or Tamil, but service to man is service to God, or service to humankind is service to God.
Right.
So when you serve people, it is part of your devotion and it is part of your worship.
Yes.
And therefore it is an honor and a privilege.
Yeah, I totally hear you in that. I mean, that's so much of what you said there about the grief-strickenness and the trauma. That resonates so powerfully with certainly my parents' experience, my uncles and aunties and cousins of mine, as I'm sure your extended family too. Now, a big theme in your books, as you've mentioned, is racism. Racism full stop and in all of its forms and subcategories. Following, the Voice referendum last year and the ongoing public politicisation of refugee policy now with Gaza refugees and so forth, what are your thoughts on race relations in Australia at the moment? As a diasporic Sri Lankan Thamil Australian, how do you think we're doing and how can we do better as a country?
Oh, geez, Max, you're really pulling out the big ones.
Yeah, if you just fix that in a 1 minute answer.
That'd be great. 30 words. I'll do it in 30 words for you.
Sure.
I'll do it in one billable unit. There is no answer. And I think if my assessment of where we are and how we're doing varies on any given day.
Right. Mine does too, actually.
Yeah. And so I think last Thursday I was asked, is it getting better? And I said, I have to believe that it is. Otherwise, I just can't get out of bed in the morning. And then a week later, I was asked in front of Ali Cobby Eckermann, who's one of Australia's greatest First Nations poets, whether we were getting better. And I said very, very slowly, yes, I think we are. And afterwards, I thought, really? Is that what I really think?
Yeah.
Or is it just that I couldn't bring myself in front of Ali Cobby Eckermann to say, Ali, I'm so sorry. You've tried. You've spent a lifetime trying, but I'm so sorry. We're nowhere near where we should or could have been.
Yeah.
So I think my answer varies on any given day. I think that if you imagine life as a journey, and this sounds really pedestrian and as though it should be in a Hallmark card, that it's not the destination, it's the journey that matters. I think when you consider the aspiration and the effort and the courage that goes into the advocacy to make this country better, then I think that is something to be proud of.
Yes.
And with Safe Haven, what I really wanted to do was to remember that. I didn't want to sit just in the horror of detention centres and indefinite or long-term detention. I wanted to sit there for a while and I wanted the reader to see it and feel it. I didn't just want to critique the inhumanity of our policies and politics and politicians that takes us to that place, although I did sit there for a while too. What I really wanted to do was to remember the greatness of communities around Australia who say, actually, that is just not good enough.
Yes.
And who want to do better and who are brave enough to try. And I want the reader ultimately to walk away remembering that it should be celebrated and elevated and remembered.
And I think sometimes fighting racism and working to a more hopeful and hope-filled place in race relations is really about what you just said, just having the bravery to try. And sometimes that can be a metric of success in itself, perhaps. Sometimes it's all we've got, so we just have to go with that, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation at work today with one of our D&I committees. They had been corrected by an Aboriginal consultant about the way NAIDOC should be celebrated and the way that National Reconciliation Week should be celebrated. And they said they felt really, really bad about it.
Right.
And I said, well, if you're not making mistakes, then the chances are you're not trying. Therefore, let's make mistakes and let's be critiqued and improved by that process. And that's an incredible thing.
Yeah, let's make them together and then move forward together.
Yep.
I don't want to single out too many characters from your books, as I know not all of our listeners will have read all of them, and I think they should, obviously. But I really love the way you wrote Gareth, who's a key character in Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens. And in a very obvious way, he's kind of the bad guy, the racist guy. He's an easy guy to demonize, outbursts of anger and so forth. But you also go some way quite clearly to explaining why he is the way he is. He's a very rich and layered character, and you definitely set up his insecurities, his identity struggles, his sense of loss. Just with him as an example, but more generally, could you please just talk a bit more about nuance in understanding those with whom we disagree? This breaking down this whole idea that the world's just good guys and bad guys. There's clearly more to it.
I think it's very easy in writing to create good guys and bad guys. It's lazy writing and it's easy to do. I think the key, and my favorite writers, the key to strong writing and the writers that I admire the most and hope to be in the same universe as in one day in the future, are those that have very strong powers of observation. So writers that are attentive to and respectful of the detail.
Right.
You have to see and notice it, and you have to care and respect it. And then you write it. And if that's your approach, then you will see almost everything. And human nature, as to my point earlier about writing something down instead of making it up, I'm not looking at Gareth and deliberately trying to create, certainly in the first 5 drafts, not trying to create a complex character with nuance and lots of moving parts to him. I'm writing what I see around me in people. And I would hope that I am naturally curious and approach people with a degree of, I hope, humility in which to try to understand them better, to observe them, to understand them, to find out where things are coming from. And I don't always do that well with the people that I love the most. So I can be less curious and less humble with my husband,
right.
Who I love the most, and my mother. But at the same time, with the world, maybe they give me the strength and the energy to go into the world and be curious and observant and humble and respectful with others, to see that nuance,
right,
and then to write it.
Yes.
And even then, Max, Gareth, in his first 5 iterations, was still actually not nuanced enough. And it was, in fact, my husband who then said to me, you've got to be careful with him, because if you make him too much of a villain, people will be able to dismiss his racism as the racism and the behavior of a bad person.
Right.
And they can distance themselves from it.
Yes.
Whereas actually what I think you want to show people is that we are all capable of this. And we're all capable of racism and prejudice and bad behavior that spirals out of control and is sometimes intentional, but sometimes not.
Right.
So I was like, wow, this is why I married you.
That's it.
And yes, you're right. So then there was a consciousness to the editorial process with Gareth to calibrate him. And despite my best efforts, to go around again 5 more rounds and say, okay, Gareth, how do we reflect a real human being?
I think this principle that you talk about of humility in the face of complexity is so key to so much of what we have to grapple with today out there in society. And, some of this comes up in political and cultural debates about dealing with past injustices, which is obviously a powerful theme, through your writing too. But debates about dealing with past injustice can often get simplified without nuance down to just victimhood on one side or forgive and forget on the other side. How do you think the importance of nuance and humility applies in that kind of thing, and how we deal with past injustice, both international injustice in places like Sri Lanka, but in Australia too?
Well, I think we have to really gear up for the complexity, because we are used to being reductive. And while we assume a certain binary nature to the law and the meting out or the execution of justice, and it's, certainly when you're getting, if I was to sort of put my lawyer's hat on, even when you get to the point of sentencing, for example, in the criminal justice system, it is very rarely, and generally mandatory sentencing, for example, is not thought of as an effective tool.
No, it's a negation of nuance or details, right?
It's exactly that by definition.
Yeah.
And I think we want to be able to bring that intelligence into the conversation well before you get to the point of sentencing, for example.
Yes.
And when we look at transitional justice programs, which are the justice programs that are developed and implemented after a country or a place has been through something so terrible that traditional mechanisms of justice are deemed not enough. So then you have these mechanisms called transitional justice.
Right.
They always all deal in nuance. They recognize that one person's version of what happened is different from another person's version of what happened. And I'm not undermining the strength, the value, or the integrity of the truth. I'm saying that when terrible things happen, and injustice is a terrible thing and an ongoing thing, we need to approach that conversation with humility, with curiosity, with integrity, and with intellect. We've been given incredible intellect. We don't deploy it as often as we should.
And however horrific the injustice is, bringing anger and bitterness to the table doesn't help get justice in any kind of restorative way. Is that right?
I think you have to recognize the anger and the bitterness.
Right.
People need to be allowed to recognize the anger and the bitterness. And it's really for each individual whether they will choose to carry that with them for the rest of their life. And I'm not going to judge or assess that, because every single one of my children, when I do a head count at night, is safe and well and living in a first world liberal democracy.
Yes.
So it's not for me to judge whether someone can or will or wants to carry their anger and bitterness forever, because it's really just a manifestation of grief, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's for the systems of power and justice and authority to recognize that and then to step above it and say, for the creation or recreation of community and society post this terrible thing, the only way to create a better future for everybody is by taking that nuanced, intelligent approach.
One of my favourite quotes from Unfinished Business, which is my favourite book of yours, by the way.
Really?
Yeah,
Thank you, Max.
I really liked it.
I like it too.
There's that line that you have which says, it's a beautiful declaration, of the importance of justice, but you say, there is a silence around the terrible things people do to each other in Sri Lanka. That's no way to live and no way to die. Now, that's a hugely confronting and challenging and powerful line, but it can apply not just to Sri Lanka, but anywhere. Human beings are capable of deep injustice. How much of your motivation as a writer is about taking that first step in bringing accountability and bringing things to light that have kind of been left in the dark for too long, or that, our conventional systems have just ignored, or even worse, hidden?
I think in my first and or last 5 novels that I've written, that the call of that has been very strong within me. The yearning and aspiration, often driven by rage and then by grief and finally by love, is very strong within me. And I am grateful for it, for whatever it is that exists within me or outside that comes to me. And I hope that I have honoured it and served it well.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Max Jagannathan.
Thank you to Shankari for such an insightful and interesting conversation. Details of Shankari's latest novel, Safe Haven, and her other 4 novels can be found on her website, linked in the show notes.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone who you think might like it. And as we say each week, please do leave us a rating or review. It helps people discover life and faith. And thanks again to our producer, the nuanced Alan Douthwaite. Life and Faith will be on a break for a little while. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. We'll see you then.